The rhythmic hum of my planer cutting across the wood filled the air, a soothing melody to anyone who'd spent enough hours in a workshop to appreciate it. For me, this space was my refuge. The scent of sawdust hung heavy, mingling with the faint metallic tang of tools and the lingering aroma of varnish from a finished project. Today I was carving a toy chest for my nephew. His baby shower was a few weeks away, and I wanted it to be perfect, something sturdy, timeless, and built to last. As I guided the wood through my hands, my thoughts drifted like they always did when I worked. The movement of the tools and the focus required to shape the design usually kept my mind clear, but lately that hadn't been the case. From the corner of my workshop, the faint sound of laughter floated in through the cracked window. I froze, my grip tightening on the wood. It was Lila. She was outside, leaning against the porch railing, her phone pressed to her ear. Her laugh rang out, light and carefree, the kind of laugh that used to mean something to me. Once upon a time, it would have been the highlight of my day. Now it only made my stomach churn. Her conversations had grown more frequent lately, often punctuated by that same laughter. I tried not to listen, but it was impossible not to notice. The tone was different, warmer, lighter, and with a familiarity that didn't belong to me anymore. At 7:45 p.m. sharp, just as I finished sanding down the first panel of the chest, I saw her. From my workshop window, I caught a glimpse of Lila stepping out the front door, heels clicking against the stone pathway. She was dressed elegantly, in a sleek navy dress that hugged her frame in all the right ways. Her hair was curled, and her makeup was flawless, subtle but striking. I watched her climb into the passenger seat of a black sedan. It was Marcus Adler's car. Marcus, my former best friend. I turned back to the chest, pretending I hadn't seen anything, but the image was already seared into my brain. Lila hadn't dressed like that for me in years. We rarely went out anymore, and when we did, it was always casual. She never wore the expensive perfume I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. But tonight, for another business dinner, she looked radiant. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Marcus and Lila worked together often. They had meetings, late-night planning sessions, and presentations for clients. But as much as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach or the way my jaw clenched at the sight of them together. "Dad!" The sharp voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Sophie, our teenage daughter, standing in the driveway. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, and her hair was windblown from her bike ride home. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, setting down my tools. "How was study group?" She huffed, crossing her arms. "Fine, I guess. Not that you'd notice." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're always out here," she snapped, gesturing at the workshop. "Do you even realize Mom's gone? Like, every night? Or are you too busy with your precious projects?" Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Sophie had been pulling away from me lately, her teenage rebellion aimed squarely in my direction. It wasn't like her to be so sharp, but I knew where it was coming from. "Your mom has work, Sophie. She's—" "Oh, please," she interrupted, rolling her eyes. "Work. Sure." I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Did she suspect something? Or was this just her frustration boiling over? "Look," I said gently. "I know things feel a little off right now, but—" "A little off?" she shot back. "You're out here all the time. She's never home. Do you even care?" Before I could respond, she stormed off, disappearing into the house and slamming the door behind her. I let out a long breath, the tension in my chest growing heavier. Sophie was right about one thing. I'd been throwing myself into my work lately, using it as a shield, but I wasn't ready to admit why. Hours passed, and the toy chest began to take shape. I lost myself in the careful strokes of my tools, each movement calculated and deliberate. The act of carving always grounded me, but tonight, even the steady rhythm of my craft couldn't quiet the unease gnawing at my mind. It was nearly midnight when I finally put down my tools, stepping back to admire the progress. The chest was coming together beautifully, its smooth edges and intricate carvings a reflection of my focus and care. I wiped my hands on a rag and reached for my water bottle, but a soft vibration caught my attention. Lila's tablet was on the workbench, where she'd left it earlier that day. The screen lit up with a notification. A message preview from someone named M. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the tablet and unlocked it without hesitation. She'd never bothered to change the passcode. The message was short but damning. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was wonderful. M. I stared at the words, the weight of their meaning hitting me like a blow to the chest. My hands trembled, and I set the tablet down before I did something impulsive. Last night, she hadn't been working. She'd been with Marcus. The confirmation of her betrayal settled over me like a cold shadow, draining the warmth from the room. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers, to make her explain how she could throw away everything we'd built. But I didn't. Instead, I sat down on the stool, my mind flooded with memories. The early days of our relationship, when laughter came easily and we dreamed of a future filled with love and possibilities. The nights we stayed up late, talking about the kind of life we wanted to build together. And now I was left with this. A hollow marriage, a daughter who resented me, and a best friend who had stabbed me in the back. I picked up my chisel and returned to the toy chest. Each stroke of the tool was deliberate, precise, a reflection of the resolve building within me. I wouldn't act rashly. Not yet. Like the wood beneath my hands, I would shape this situation carefully. I would wait, watch, and plan. Because if Lila thought she could keep living this lie, she was wrong. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped into Whitaker Hardware, the familiar scent of lumber and metal filling the air. Ben Whitaker, my oldest friend, stood behind the counter, organizing a shelf of screws. He looked up, his face breaking into a grin that quickly faded when he saw my expression. "Ethan," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "you look like you've been through it. What's going on?" Ben had always been my sounding board, the kind of friend you could rely on when life threw a curveball. Today, I needed his steady presence more than ever. "Got time for a coffee?" I asked, nodding toward the small break area in the back. He raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. "Sure thing. Let me grab a pot." A few minutes later, we sat at a worn table in the corner of the store, steam rising from two mismatched mugs. I hadn't planned to unload everything, but the moment Ben asked, "What's eating at you?" the words poured out. "I think Lila's having an affair," I said, my voice low but steady. Ben froze, his coffee halfway to his lips. "Lila? Are you sure?" I nodded. "Saw the messages. It's with Marcus." His face darkened, and he set his mug down with a soft thud. "Marcus Adler? Your old buddy Marcus." "The same." Ben leaned back, shaking his head. "Man, that's low, even for him. What are you gonna do?" I hesitated. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But there's something else I wanted to ask you about. Marcus is always bragging about his real estate projects. You ever hear anything about Green Valley Estates?" Ben frowned, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. "Yeah, I've heard of it. Big project he's been working on for a while now. But there've been rumors, stuff about budget overruns, unpaid contractors, maybe even some funny business with permits." I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "Funny business?" "Nothing solid," he admitted. "Just whispers. But Marcus isn't exactly known for playing it straight. If he's cutting corners, it wouldn't surprise me." I filed that information away, every detail painting a clearer picture of the man Marcus had become. If he was willing to cheat in business, it wasn't a stretch to believe he'd cheat in other areas too. "Thanks, Ben," I said, standing. "I appreciate it." He followed me to the door, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Ethan, whatever you do, don't go it alone. You need anything at all, you call me, all right?" I nodded, grateful for his support. "I will." That afternoon, I drove to my sister Emma's office. Emma Callahan wasn't just my sister. She was one of the sharpest lawyers I knew. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was her. Her office was tidy and professional, with shelves lined with books and case files. She looked up from her desk as I entered, her eyes narrowing in concern. "Ethan," she said, standing to greet me, "what's going on?" You never come by unannounced. I sank into the chair across from her, my hands resting on the armrests. I need your advice. Legal advice. Her brow furrowed as she sat back down. All right, tell me what's going on. I told her everything, the messages, Marcus, the growing distance between Lila and me. Emma listened intently, her expression a mix of sympathy and determination. What do you want to do? She asked when I finished. I want to protect myself, I said. Financially, legally, everything. If this blows up, I don't want to be caught off guard. She nodded, pulling out a notepad. First things first, you need to start documenting everything. Bank statements, credit card charges, messages, anything that could be used to show what's been going on. And make sure it's all backed up somewhere secure. I've already started, I said, thinking of the files I'd compiled the night before. Good, she said. Second, don't make any big moves just yet.
No confrontations. No accusations.
Keep things as normal as possible while you get your ducks in a row. I nodded, appreciating her level-headed approach. And Ethan, she added, her tone softening, don't lose yourself in this. It's easy to let anger take over, but you've got to stay focused. Remember who you are. Her words hit home, and I promised myself I wouldn't let the situation consume me. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, poring over our household finances. Lila's reckless spending wasn't news to me, but seeing it laid out in black and white still made my stomach turn. Spa weekends, designer clothes, expensive gifts for Sophie. It all added up. Sophie's expenses were harder to look at. She was just a teenager, caught in the crossfire of something she didn't fully understand. But her loyalty to Lila, and her growing disdain for me, were evident in the way she flaunted the new gadgets and clothes her mother lavished on her. Instead of confronting them, I documented everything. Receipts, bank statements, even screenshots of Lila's recent purchases. I didn't know how it would all fit into the bigger picture, but I wasn't leaving anything to chance. That night, Lila surprised me by inviting me to dinner with her and Marcus. You should come, she said, her tone overly casual. It'll be nice to get out for a bit. I glanced up from the toy chest I was working on, meeting her gaze with calm detachment. Thanks, but I'll pass. She hesitated, as if trying to read my expression, but I gave her nothing. Suit yourself, she said, grabbing her coat. From my workshop window I watched her leave. The same navy sedan pulled up, and Marcus leaned across the passenger seat to open the door for her. I clenched my jaw but didn't move. Instead, I turned back to the toy chest. The smooth curves and intricate carvings were taking shape under my hands, each stroke of the chisel deliberate and precise. The work grounded me, gave me focus, and kept my emotions in check. As the hours passed, my thoughts sharpened, forming a strategy as carefully crafted as the wood beneath my hands. Lila and Marcus thought they were clever, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice, about reclaiming the life they tried to steal from me. And I wasn't going to let them win. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting long golden streaks across the table where I sat. In front of me, a manila envelope rested like a ticking clock, holding within it the end of something that had already been crumbling for years. I stared at the divorce papers for a moment longer, taking one final breath to steady myself before calling Lila into the room. When she appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, I noticed the faint hesitation in her step. Maybe she could feel the shift in the air, or maybe she just wasn't used to seeing me this composed. What's going on? She asked, her tone clipped, as if I'd interrupted something more important. I gestured toward the envelope. We need to talk. She set her coffee down, sliding into the chair across from me. Her eyes flicked to the envelope, and for a moment, a flash of unease crossed her face. What's this? I pushed it toward her. Read it. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the envelope, reluctant but curious. When she finally pulled out the papers and scanned the first few lines, her expression shifted. Shock, disbelief, and then anger. Divorce? She spat, slamming the papers onto the table. What the hell is this, Ethan? It's exactly what it looks like, I replied evenly. I know about you and Marcus. I know about the money you've been siphoning out of our accounts. And I know about the lies. She leaned back, crossing her arms defensively. This is ridiculous. You're blowing everything out of proportion. Marcus and I are just friends. And as for the money, don't. I interrupted, my voice sharp but controlled. Don't lie to me, Lila. I've seen the messages. I've seen the receipts. I know exactly what's been going on. For a moment, she faltered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Then she shifted tactics. This is your fault, Ethan, she snapped. You've been so wrapped up in that workshop of yours. Ignoring me, ignoring Sophie, ignoring everything that matters. What did you expect me to do? Just sit around and wait for you to notice me? Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. I expected you to talk to me, I said calmly. I expected you to honor the vows we made. And I expected you to show the same respect and loyalty that I've always shown you. Before she could respond, Sophie entered the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a scowl already forming on her face. What's going on? She asked, her eyes darting between us. Lila didn't hesitate. Your father's decided to give up on this family. He's divorcing me. Sophie's eyes widened, and then, just as quickly, they narrowed in anger. Seriously? What's wrong with you, Dad? Mom's been doing everything for this family while you're out in that stupid workshop. I sighed, meeting her glare with a steady gaze. Sophie, this isn't just about me or the workshop. Your mother. She's been holding this family together. Sophie interrupted, her voice rising. You're the one who's never here. Lila placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, playing the role of the wounded victim perfectly. I knew you'd spin this to make me the bad guy, Lila said, her voice laced with bitterness. But Sophie knows the truth. She sees what you've turned into. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I knew it was pointless. Sophie had already chosen her side, and nothing I said now would change her mind. Instead, I stood and walked to the counter, grabbing a folder I'd prepared earlier. I'm not here to argue, I said, setting the folder next to the papers. I'm here to inform you. Our joint accounts are closed. The house is now under a trust in my name. You'll have time to gather your things, but you'll need to find another place to stay. Lila's face went pale, her confidence faltering for the first time. You can't just. I already have, I said, cutting her off. And before you think about fighting me on this, know that every penny you've spent has been documented. Every lie, every betrayal, it's all there. You wanted to act like none of this would catch up to you, but it has. The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Sophie looked at me like I was a stranger, her disbelief mirroring her mother's. I didn't want it to come to this, I said finally, my voice soft but firm. But I'm not going to let you take any more from me. It's over. I left them sitting there, the folder and papers between them, and walked out the door. Meanwhile, Marcus's empire was starting to crumble. I'd been careful in how I exposed him, feeding information to the right people in the right way. Investors in Green Valley estates began pulling out one by one, spooked by whispers of financial irregularities. Contractors stopped returning his calls, and rumors of impending legal trouble spread like wildfire. Ben kept me updated, his hardware store serving as a hub for the local grapevine. Word is Marcus is scrambling, Ben told me one afternoon. He's been trying to reassure everyone that everything's fine, but no one's buying it. I nodded, a small flicker of satisfaction lighting in my chest. Marcus had built his success on lies and shortcuts, and now the foundation was collapsing beneath him. Back at home, I returned to my workshop, finding solace in the steady rhythm of my tools. The toy chest was nearly complete now, its smooth edges and intricate carvings a reflection of the care and precision I'd poured into it. It wasn't just a gift for my nephew, it was a symbol, a patience, of resolve, of the quiet strength it takes to rebuild when everything around you feels like it's falling apart. As I ran my hands over the wood, I felt a sense of clarity that had eluded me for months. Lila and Marcus had underestimated me. They thought their betrayals would go unnoticed, that their lies would remain hidden. But now the truth was out. The cracks in their world were widening, and I wasn't the one who was going to fall through them. The meeting with Mr. Caldwell didn't go as Lila had hoped. She arrived at the lawyer's office dressed in her best, the tailored gray suit and polished heels an attempt to project confidence. But beneath her composed exterior, there was desperation in her eyes, a desperation she could no longer hide. "Mrs. Ravenswood," Mr. Caldwell began, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his imposing mahogany desk. "I've reviewed the documents you provided and compared them with the records submitted by your husband's attorney." He paused, his gaze steady but impersonal. "I'm afraid there isn't much we can contest." Lila's polite mask cracked, her carefully painted smile fading. "What do you mean?" He froze the accounts, transferred the house into a trust. "I didn't agree to any of this." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together. "That may be true, but Mr. Ravenswood's actions were entirely legal. He began securing his assets months ago, long before the divorce filing. The trust was established in accordance with state law, and the financial records show a consistent pattern of reckless spending on your part." Lila blinked, caught off guard. "Reckless spending? I was managing a household, raising Sophie." Caldwell held up a hand, cutting her off. "The court will not see spa trips, designer clothing, and unexplained withdrawals as essential household expenses. Your husband's documentation is thorough. There is little chance of reversing the transfers." Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "So you're saying I'm left with nothing?" Caldwell hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm saying that Mr. Ravenswood was meticulous. You signed joint account agreements, which he closed after observing financial inconsistencies. The house is now protected under a trust, and his business is solely under his name. Legally, you don't have a claim to those assets." Lila's breath caught, and for the first time, the gravity of her situation truly hit her. Ethan had planned this. He'd anticipated her every move, leaving her with no foothold to fight back. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Is there anything I can do?" Caldwell's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "We can pursue alimony based on his income, but given the documentation he's provided, I wouldn't expect much. My advice, Mrs. Ravenswood? Focus on rebuilding your life. The longer you dwell on this, the harder it will be to move forward." Lila left the office in a daze, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her like a stone. Back at home, Sophie was waiting. The tension between mother and daughter had grown unbearable in recent weeks, as the cracks in their privileged lifestyle became impossible to ignore. Sophie's usual luxuries, new clothes, gadgets, expensive outings, had all but disappeared, and she was far from understanding about the situation. "What did he say?" Sophie demanded as soon as Lila walked through the door. Lila dropped her purse onto the counter, her composure barely holding. "There's nothing he can do. Your father planned all of this. The accounts, the house, it's all locked up. We have nothing." Sophie's frustration boiled over, her voice rising with anger. "So this is my fault now? You're the one who lied to him. You're the one who let everything fall apart." Lila turned to her, her face pale and drawn. "Sophie, I am trying." "No, you're not," Sophie interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't think about me at all. You were too busy with Marcus and your stupid excuses." The words hit Lila like a slap, leaving her momentarily speechless. Sophie stormed out of the room, slamming her bedroom door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, underscoring the silence that followed. Lila sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. The world she'd so carefully constructed was crumbling around her, and she had no one to blame but herself. Across town, Marcus Adler's world was unraveling even faster. His arrest had been swift and public, the culmination of weeks of quiet investigation. Ethan's careful gathering of evidence had reached the authorities, exposing Marcus's fraudulent real estate dealings in excruciating detail. Investors in Green Valley estates demanded accountability, pulling their money and leaving the project in ruins. The morning news covered the story extensively, cameras capturing Marcus being led out of his office in handcuffs. His face, once smug and confident, was now etched with humiliation. Ben texted me the link to the story, and I watched it with a quiet sense of closure. "You seeing this?" Ben wrote. "Yep," I replied simply. I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, there was a strange calmness in knowing that Marcus was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Back in my workshop, I focused on the toy chest. The scent of varnish filled the air as I applied the final coat, each stroke of the brush deliberate and measured. The wood gleamed under the soft light, every detail a testament to the patience and care I'd poured into it. When I stepped back to admire the finished piece, a sense of pride washed over me. This chest, with its smooth curves and intricate carvings, wasn't just a gift for my nephew. It was a reflection of the strength I'd cultivated in the face of betrayal. I thought of Lila and Sophie, still reeling from the changes in their lives. I thought of Marcus, sitting in a holding cell, his empire in ruins. And I thought of myself, standing in this workshop, steady and grounded despite the storm that had passed. This wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. I reached for a chisel, running my fingers along its edge. There was still work to be done. Not just in the workshop, but in my life. And I was ready for it. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of fresh sawdust from my workshop. I'd thrown myself into another project, an oak rocking chair this time. The repetitive rhythm of carving kept my mind clear, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming. Sure enough, just after 10 a.m., I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. I glanced through the workshop window and saw Lila, her shoulders slumped, walking toward the door. I didn't stop what I was doing. The sound of the chisel against the wood continued as she stepped inside, her hesitant footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "Ethan," she said, her voice unsteady. "We need to talk." I didn't look up. "I think we've said all we need to." She took another step closer, wringing her hands. "Please, Ethan. I need you to hear me out." With a sigh, I set the chisel down and turned to face her. She looked different. Tired, worn down. Her once carefully styled hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept. "What do you want, Lila?" I asked, my tone calm but firm. She hesitated, her gaze darting around the workshop as if searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about everything, what happened, how we got here. And I know I made mistakes, but we have so much history, Ethan. We built a life together. Doesn't that count for something?" Her words might have once stirred something in me, but now they felt hollow. "Our history," I said slowly, "is exactly why this hurts so much. We built something together, and you chose to tear it apart." "I didn't mean to," she said quickly, her voice cracking. "I was lost, Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you what I was feeling. I know I betrayed your trust, but can't we find a way to fix this?" I studied her, searching for sincerity, but all I saw was desperation. "Trust isn't something you just patch up with an apology," I said. "Once it's broken, it's never the same. You didn't just betray me, Lila. You disrespected everything we built." She flinched at my words, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, and the way she had made me feel like a stranger in my own home. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said, softening my tone slightly. "I'm doing this because I deserve better. We both know it's too late to go back." Lila opened her mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she nodded and turned toward the door. As she left, I felt no anger, no sadness, just a quiet resolve. Sophie, meanwhile, was struggling to adjust to her new reality. She'd taken a part-time job at a local cafe, something she never would have imagined herself doing a few months ago. Watching her tie on an apron and take orders was a stark contrast to the life she'd been used to, where everything she wanted seemed to appear with little effort. One evening, after her shift, I found her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. "How was work?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She shrugged, not looking up. "Fine, I guess." I walked into the room and sat down across from her. "I know this isn't easy, Sophie, but sometimes we learn the most from the hard stuff." She looked up at me then, her eyes tired but thoughtful. "I still don't get why you couldn't just forgive her." Her words stung, but I kept my voice steady. "It's not about forgiveness, Sophie. It's about respect. Your mom made choices that hurt this family, and there are consequences to that. I can forgive her, but that doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were." Sophie nodded slowly, and though she didn't say much else, I could see the gears turning in her mind. Across town, Marcus was facing the full weight of those consequences. His cell was small and cold, a far cry from the luxury he had once surrounded himself with. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a grim realization of how far he'd fallen. The charges against him were extensive: fraud, embezzlement, and a string of other financial crimes tied to his real estate ventures. The investors he had once charmed were now his greatest adversaries, demanding restitution and tarnishing what little reputation he had left. Ethan Ravenswood, he thought bitterly. Marcus knew I had played a part in his downfall, though he couldn't prove it. He'd underestimated me, assumed I would quietly fade into the background. That assumption had cost him everything. In the stillness of his cell, he couldn't escape the truth. His greed and betrayal had been his undoing. Back in my workshop, the rocking chair was nearly complete. Emma stopped by that evening, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she leaned against the doorframe. "Lila came to see me," I said, not looking up from my work. Emma raised an eyebrow. "And she wants to reconcile." Emma let out a dry laugh. "Of course she does. And what did you say?" I paused, running a hand over the smooth curve of the chair. "I told her the truth, that it's too late." Emma's expression softened, and she walked over to stand beside me. "You've done everything right, Ethan. But are you okay? Really?" I met her gaze and nodded. "I'm fine, Emma. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about ensuring everyone gets what they deserve." She studied me for a moment before placing a hand on my shoulder. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too." I smiled faintly. "Don't worry about me. I've got plenty to keep me grounded." As the evening turned to night, I sat alone in the workshop, the weight of the past months settling over me. The chair, the chest, the countless hours spent shaping wood. All of it was more than just work. It was a reflection of who I was becoming. I didn't need to shout or scream or seek vengeance to find closure. Justice, I had learned, is best served quietly, with patience and precision. The sound of the moving trucks rumbling faded into the distance, leaving only silence behind. Lila stood in the doorway of the small apartment, the beige walls and threadbare carpet a far cry from the spacious home she'd once taken for granted. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse as Sophie brushed past her. "Great," Sophie muttered, dropping her bag on the floor with a thud. "This is cozy." Lila shot her a warning glance but didn't reply. Her daughter's sarcasm was the least of her worries. The apartment was modest. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that barely fit the couch they'd managed to bring with them. It wasn't much, but it was all they could afford now. Sophie paced the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "So this is it? This is where we're living now." Lila turned toward her, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's what we can afford, Sophie. You think I wanted this? Well, maybe if you hadn't—" Sophie stopped herself, her face twisting with the effort of holding back words she wasn't ready to say. Lila's jaw tightened. "If you're going to blame me for everything, just say it. Don't hold back." Sophie shook her head, turning away. "Forget it." The tension in the room was suffocating, and Lila felt the familiar sting of bitterness creeping in. This wasn't how her life was supposed to turn out. She had spent years building an image, a life of stability and comfort, only to watch it crumble under the weight of her own choices. But even now, as she stood in the wreckage, part of her refused to fully accept responsibility. Sophie, on the other hand, was beginning to see things differently. Her part-time job at the cafe had started as a nuisance, a reminder of everything she'd lost. But over time, she found herself taking pride in small victories, learning to make the perfect cappuccino, managing a shift without mistakes, earning compliments from regular customers. It wasn't much, but it was something she could call her own. One evening, after a long shift, Sophie sat at the small dining table with her mother, staring at the bills spread out before them. "I don't think we can afford this," Sophie said quietly, pointing to the cable subscription. Lila frowned. "We'll figure it out." Sophie hesitated, then looked up at her mother. "Maybe we don't need cable. I mean, it's just TV." The suggestion caught Lila off guard. Sophie, who had once been the first to demand the latest gadgets and subscriptions, was now the voice of practicality. "Since when are you okay with giving things up?" Lila asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Sophie shrugged, picking at the edge of a bill. "Since I realized we don't really have a choice." Lila didn't respond. The truth was, Sophie's willingness to adapt only highlighted Lila's own inability to do the same. Meanwhile, across town, I continued to thrive in my workshop. The orders had been pouring in: custom furniture, intricate carvings, even a few restoration projects. My reputation for craftsmanship was spreading, and the success of the business gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. I spent most of my days working in the shop, the familiar rhythm of tools and wood providing a kind of therapy. In the evenings, I would go over orders and designs, finding comfort in the quiet solitude of my new routine. Emma, ever the protective sister, sent me a letter one morning. She'd always been the one to write rather than call, her words carrying a weight that phone conversations couldn't match. "Ethan, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. You've handled everything with more grace than I think most people could manage, and I'm proud of you for that. But I worry sometimes that you're too focused on justice, on making sure everyone pays for what they've done. You've already won, Ethan. Don't let the past keep its claws in you. Let it go. Love, Emma." I read her letter twice, then set it on the workbench. She wasn't wrong. I had been focused on ensuring that the people who betrayed me faced the consequences of their actions. But it wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about making sure I could move forward knowing I'd done everything I could to set things right. Marcus, now in his 3rd month of incarceration, spent his days replaying the choices that had led him to this point. At first, he had tried to pin the blame on external factors: the market, bad timing, even Ethan. But the truth was impossible to ignore. His greed and arrogance had been his undoing. Sitting in his cell, he thought about the life he had lost, the respect of his peers, the trust of his family, the freedom he'd taken for granted. Marcus had always believed he could outmaneuver anyone, but Ethan had proved him wrong. He would never admit it out loud, but in the stillness of his cell, he found himself almost admiring the quiet precision with which Ethan had dismantled his world. One rainy afternoon, Lila made her way to the workshop again. This time, there was no pretense of confidence. She stood in the doorway, her umbrella dripping onto the floor as she looked at me with tired eyes. "Ethan," she said softly, "I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know.
I'm sorry."
I didn't stop working. The piece I was carving, a cedar bench, was almost done, and I didn't want to lose my rhythm. "Sorry doesn't change anything, Lila," I said without looking up. "I know," she said quickly, stepping further inside. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to move on." I set the chisel down and turned to face her. "You start by taking responsibility. You stop making excuses. And you accept that some things can't be undone." She blinked, her lip trembling. "You don't have to be so harsh." "This isn't harsh," I said evenly. "This is honest. You made choices, Lila. Choices that hurt me, hurt Sophie, hurt yourself. And now you have to live with them." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. That part of me had been burned away. "Actions have consequences," I said finally. "And it's time you faced yours." Lila left without another word, the rain swallowing the sound of her footsteps. By the end of the day, the cedar bench was finished. I ran my hands over the smooth surface, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath my fingers. This was what I'd built, steady, solid, and enduring. And no matter what the past had taken from me, I knew it couldn't take this. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness I'd come to cherish over the years. My workshop smelled of cedar and varnish, and the steady rhythm of my carving knife against wood was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Outside, the sun peeked through the trees, casting long golden shadows across the floor. On the workbench sat a stack of mail, mostly invoices and catalogs, but one envelope stood out. A handwritten letter addressed to me in a neat, careful script. I set my tools down, wiped my hands, and opened it. The first line stopped me in my tracks. Dear Dad, I don't know where to start, except to say I'm sorry. I leaned back in my chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands as I read on. It's been years since everything fell apart, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. I know I hurt you, and I know I let Mom's choices cloud my judgment. I didn't understand back then what you were going through or how much strength it took for you to handle things the way you did. But now,
Ido.
Sophie's words were raw and honest, the kind of honesty I'd hoped she'd find someday. Working at the cafe wasn't just a job, it was a wake-up call. I learned how to stand on my own, how to take responsibility, and how to value the things that really matter. I used to think the world owed me something, but now I know that nothing worth having comes without hard work and integrity. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to. A lump formed in my throat as I continued reading. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. I'm studying business at night school and saving up to start my own bakery one day. It's slow, but it feels right, and I owe a lot of that to you. The letter ended with a simple, heartfelt message. Thank you for showing me that even when everything feels broken, it's still possible to rebuild. I love you, Dad. Sophie. I set the letter down, my chest tight with emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. For years, I had wondered if Sophie would ever see the truth behind what had happened. Her letter didn't erase the past, but it offered something else, hope. Across town, Lila sat in a small apartment, the walls lined with shelves of books and old photos. Her once vibrant energy had faded, replaced by a frailty that came with time and illness. She rarely ventured outside anymore, preferring the solitude of her living room, where she spent hours replaying the choices that had led her here. Her health had begun to decline a year ago, a chronic condition that slowed her down and left her with more time than she wanted to reflect. Lila had stopped reaching out to me after her last visit to the workshop, choosing instead to keep her distance. But I occasionally heard about her through Emma, who would drop off groceries or check in on her when she could. She's not the same woman she used to be, Emma told me once. She's quieter now, a little sadder, but she's finally starting to see things clearly. I didn't ask for details. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened. Marcus, meanwhile, remained in prison, his bright future reduced to a distant memory. His days were spent in monotony, the walls of his cell a stark reminder of what he had lost. Occasionally, he'd try to rationalize his downfall, blaming bad luck or unfair circumstances. But deep down, he knew the truth. His greed and arrogance had been his undoing. Though I rarely thought about Marcus anymore, I couldn't help but wonder if he ever truly regretted his choices, or if he simply regretted getting caught. As for me, life had taken on a new rhythm. The workshop had grown, and with it, my reputation as a craftsman and a man of integrity. Orders came in from all over the state, and I took pride in knowing that each piece I made carried the care and dedication that had defined my work from the beginning. Emma and Ben remained constants in my life, their support unwavering even as the years passed. One afternoon, Emma sent me a postcard from a weekend trip to the mountains. On the back, she wrote, "I miss the old Ethan sometimes, the one who always had a joke or a story to share. But I get it now. You had to change to survive. And I'm proud of the man you've become." Ben, ever the steady presence, still ran the hardware store and occasionally stopped by the workshop to share a beer and catch up. "You've done good, Ethan," he said one evening, leaning against the workbench. "Not just with the business, but with everything. You didn't just rebuild your life. You rebuilt yourself." I nodded, appreciating his words but knowing there was still more to do. One night, I sat on the porch of my house, watching the stars blink into view. The air was crisp and quiet, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Sophie's letter sat on the table beside me, along with Emma's postcard and a stack of new orders. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. The choices Lila and Marcus had made were theirs to live with, just as my own choices were mine. This life I had built, steady, honest, and fulfilling, was proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and care. I picked up the chisel sitting beside me, running my fingers along its handle. There was still work to be done, still lessons to be learned. But as I looked out at the quiet expanse of my property, I knew one thing for certain. The man I had become wasn't a product of their betrayal. He was a product of my resilience, and that was a legacy worth building. The sun streamed through the tall windows of my workshop, illuminating the polished wood floors and casting warm light over the projects in progress. The familiar scent of sawdust and varnish filled the air as the faint sound of chisels and sanding blocks echoed softly. This place had grown beyond what I ever imagined. What started as a small escape from the chaos of my life had turned into something much bigger. I now had a team of apprentices, young, eager faces looking to learn the craft. Each of them brought their own story, their own reason for wanting to be here. Some were searching for a creative outlet, others for a fresh start, and a few had simply fallen in love with the art of woodworking. They worked with a quiet determination, their focus mirroring the care and precision I had always prided myself on. I walked between the workstations, offering advice here, correcting a technique there. Watching them reminded me of my early days in the shop, when every project felt like a lifeline. The business had gained recognition over the years. My pieces were now displayed in galleries, featured in magazines, and commissioned by clients who appreciated the craftsmanship and integrity behind every design. But the accolades weren't what drove me. It was the process, the act of shaping raw, unyielding wood into something beautiful and lasting. During a rare quiet moment, I sat at my desk flipping through a stack of mail. Among the usual invoices and correspondence was a letter with Sophie's name scrawled across the envelope. I set it aside at first, unsure if I was ready to read it. But curiosity won out, and eventually, I opened it, letting her words wash over me. Dear Dad, I'm writing this because there are things I need to say, things I should have said years ago.
I'm sorry.
For the way I treated you, for the things I said, for blaming you when none of this was your fault. Her words were thoughtful and raw, filled with an honesty that I hadn't expected. You were stronger than I realized back then. I see that now. You didn't just walk away from what Mom and Marcus did, you stood up for yourself, and you showed me what it means to rebuild. I've carried that lesson with me every day. She went on to describe her life now. I'm a teacher, she wrote. Can you believe that? The girl who used to hate responsibility now spends her days helping kids learn and grow. I think you'd like the person I've become. And I hope, someday, I can be half as steady and resilient as you are. Her words stirred something deep within me. A mixture of pride, sorrow, and closure. I don't expect anything from you, Dad. I just wanted you to know that I'm grateful for the lessons you taught me, even if you didn't mean to. I hope you're happy. I hope you found peace. You deserve it. The letter ended simply, but her message lingered long after I set it down. I thought about responding, but something held me back. Some bridges I had learned couldn't be rebuilt. Not because of anger or resentment, but because the distance between what was and what is had grown too great. Still, her letter offered something I hadn't realized I needed. An acknowledgement of the past and a sense of closure for what we had lost. The days passed in a blur of work and creativity. My latest project, a set of intricately carved doors commissioned for a historic home, demanded my full attention. The wood was dense and rich, requiring careful precision to bring out its natural beauty. I found solace in the work, each cut and curve a reminder of how far I'd come. The man I once was, the husband, the father, the friend, was gone. But in his place, I had built someone stronger, someone defined not by what he'd lost but by what he'd created. Occasionally I thought of Lila, of Sophie, of Marcus, not with bitterness or regret, but with a quiet acceptance. Their choices had shaped my journey, but they no longer defined it. Emma and Ben still checked in regularly, their unwavering support a constant source of comfort. "You've changed," Emma said one evening as we shared a quiet dinner. "But I think it's the kind of change that needed to happen." I nodded, understanding what she meant. The person I'd become wasn't the same man who had sat in this workshop years ago, reeling from betrayal. He was someone who had learned to let go, to rebuild, and to find peace in the process. As I finished the final touches on the carved doors, I stepped back to admire the work. The patterns were intricate yet balanced, the craftsmanship a reflection of everything I had poured into it. This was my legacy, not just the physical pieces I created, but the lessons they embodied: patience, resilience, and the quiet strength to endure. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Betrayal had once threatened to define my life, but it hadn't. I'd chosen a different path, a path of integrity, patience, and purpose. I returned to the workshop, picking up a fresh piece of wood and running my hands over its rough surface. There was still work to be done, still beauty to create, still lessons to be learned. As the sound of the chisel echoed through the room, I smiled, knowing that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.